Hi. I did think of wearing the jacket to wake you all up after lunch, but I've been talked out of it. Okay. I want to talk about how we deal with two different wholesale broadband providers. I think there's quite a lot of people in here that are relatively small ISPs and deal with one or other of these providers and might be interested to deal with both. So, I want to start off by explaining what I mean by a wholesale broadband provider. So I've done a nice little diagram for you. Now, there are other ways of doing this. You can put your own equipment in the exchange, you can buy backhaul and buy things and do it all yourself, and some larger ISPs do, but for a lot of us, this is what we're buying. We're buying something from a host link on the far left here, connecting to us, probably a fibre in a data centre, all the way across a national network involving routers and switches and BVASs and equipment in the exchange, and a local access copper pair all the way through to a network termination point, the back of the master socket at the customer premises. And the key thing here is that the wholesale provider that sells us a service is responsible for linking us from our host link all the way through to the end user's premises at their master socket and providing that broadband service and making sure it works. And they use equipment of their own and equipment they maintain, and they might buy in things from people like BT plc trading as OpenReach. I hope I'm not being silly putting this diagram up here. You probably all know exactly what I'm showing here, but we do encounter problems even talking to these wholesale providers where they seem not to realise what they actually sell us. So I think it's an important diagram to start with. So the two wholesale providers I'm talking about, the first one is BT plc trading as BT Wholesale, and the other is TalkTalk Communications Limited, trading as TalkTalk Business. Now, we tend to call them TalkTalk Wholesale rather confusingly, so that throughout this slide you'll see BTW and TTW. And I want to cover sort of four main areas. So there's the commercial aspects that I'm sure will be of great interest to any of you that actually have to spend the money. The technical aspects, which hopefully will interest everyone here. A little bit about billing, which could be incredibly boring, and some of the operational aspects of how we deal with these people. So we'll start with the commercial. Well, unfortunately, I can't go into huge amounts of detail on the commercial side. In theory, there are price lists for some people, like BT Wholesale, but they can all do deals in various ways, some of which are subject to non-disclosure agreements. But what I can tell you is that they're very similar. It's sometimes difficult to work it out. BT had a Market 3 rebate thing, which I think is now Market B or something. I can never remember how it changes. And we spent a very long conference call with BT, actually understanding what we're really paying for stuff, and managed to work out at the end of the day it was remarkably similar to what we pay TalkTalk. Now, they both charge for the backhaul, megabits per second. They can both do 95th percentile. BT can do that now, which is nice. There is a slight gotcha. TalkTalk will try and do 95th percentile, which is industry standard, of your transmit and receive added together, which is very much not industry standard. So if you are talking to TalkTalk, you might want to negotiate that slightly differently and be a bit more sane. They both charge for tails, the end user connection in some way, a monthly fee depending on the type of connection. They do have some slight differences still. TalkTalk have a minimum term, but I don't think they have a cease fee, whereas BT have a disconnection or cease fee, but for most ADSL, the minimum term is only 1 month. But it does depend on the exact product. But overall, they're very similar, which is quite useful. So, commercially similar, how are they technically? I've broken this down into 3 separate sections. The host link, which is where they plug into us in the data center, the backhaul, which is how the data gets across the country, and the end user tails, which is where we're actually talking about the bit that's really broadband. So the host link side, well, again, TalkTalk can do some nice deals on this. They offered us a free host link. Well, actually, we would charge for the host link, but when we reached a certain number of tails connected, we got that back. So it was quite a sensible deal. So they didn't have a huge risk that we weren't going to connect people, and we had an incentive to get people connected. They were fairly flexible on this, which is nice. BT tend to work on much more standard pricing for this, but they are working on some in-building handover stuff. I don't think we've quite got it in Telehouse yet, but it's been on the cards for quite a while. That should make things quicker and cheaper to connect to BT as well. So that's quite good news. Once we've actually got links into these people, there's BGP on the link. It's fairly trivial BGP. It's mainly so we can announce our LNSs, our L2TP endpoints, into them, and they can announce all their BVASs, their LACs back into us so that we can actually communicate with each other. But that's done just through a simple BGP link. Of course, being BGP, it makes it relatively easy to arrange various sorts of fallback arrangements if you need. They both do session steering radius. Now, this means whenever an end user tries to connect, before we get the L2TP connection coming into us, we get a radius request, and we can respond to tell them where to send that connection. A slight tip here, we don't respond to any requests saying no. We don't reject any requests. Largely because if you reject a broadband router, it will come back to you a second later, or half a second later, or 5 seconds later, and it will do so all day. It will keep trying. So if you want to actually reject a login, one of the things we do at an L2TP level is we accept it and dump it into a walled garden that's going nowhere. There's no point in rejecting it. So what we answer the session steering with is telling BT which LNS to connect to. There is a bit of a difference here, circuit IDs. As you might know, when you get an L2TP connection, there's a circuit ID. Now on BT, this is very straightforward. Part of the order process gives us a BBEU number or something similar, a circuit ID, and when the connection comes in, we're given that. That allows us to identify the customer even without a username and password if we want. It's really useful for auto-provisioning routers, for example, because we know exactly which line it's on. TalkTalk, on the other hand, it's a little bit more guesswork. In the order process, we can ask them which exchange, rack, shelf, card, port they're on, and we can take a pretty good guess at what that's going to look like as a circuit ID coming in, but it's got some wild cards in there and things like this. So when we eventually see the connection and the username matches, we can tie it up and record the circuit ID. So it's not quite as clear-cut, which is a shame. It would be great if they just had a circuit ID or even just told us what the circuit ID is actually going to be during ordering. That would be lovely. So there is a slight difference technically in that respect. We'll move on to backhaul next. So the first thing we do with the backhaul is we are monitoring our suppliers. We have our nice shiny Firebricks that do an LCP echo on every line, every second, give us these nice graphs. And this kind of lets us hold these suppliers to account. If we look at BT Wholesale, their backhaul, well, it goes through phases. For a while now, it's been okay. The last big issue we had was when they were doing major upgrades from 1 gig to 10 gig links in their network. And that eventually got sorted, and they've been fine for probably a couple of years. And we're now seeing problems again. So yes, we're seeing some somewhat shitty overloaded links where a whole exchange has evening latency. This particular graph here, this is on a Sunday, so there's 2 humps of evening latency. I'm wondering if things like Netflix are a factor here. During the week, it's 1 hump in the evening for high latency because of a congested link. Unfortunately, they can also be very slow to fix these. This particular problem, they're currently saying June, which is, yeah, not really on. TalkTalk, on the other hand, they seem to have really good backhaul. Now, this is partly because they came into the game a little later. They were able to put in newer equipment, higher speed links. They also have a different internal model for how they build this. So BT will be buying capacity on links, whereas TalkTalk will just have a bit of glass in the ground. So they have slightly different approaches to how they manage bandwidth. And TalkTalk seem to have enough capacity to cope without any signs of congestion. We did have a case that looked like congestion, and we were somewhat dismayed that this was our first case, and we spoke to a chap who's actually in this room somewhere, and within minutes he'd realised there was a configuration problem on a port, fixed it, won a script to find it on every other exchange, fixed those before anyone had even seen the problem, and everything was sorted almost straight away. So it wasn't congestion, and they were quite pleased that we'd pointed it out and found an issue that was fixed. We did have an issue a while ago where they seemed to have some alternative routing with extra latency occasionally. I think that's gone away. We haven't had anyone complaining about that lately. So generally, the TalkTalk backhaul just works and is, so far, better than the BT backhaul. End-user tails, the actual broadband bit at the end. Well, BT have got 20CN ADSL1 lines and 21CN that does ADSL2+, it goes a bit faster, so 20CN's up to 7.15 meg of IP, 21CN's about 20 meg you can get, depending on the line. BT also has DLM, Dynamic Line Management. It's almost impossible to disable, and it causes a lot of trouble. And we don't have any direct control over the line profile. Now, there are some settings. We can do an SNR reset on a line, set a line profile. The problem is if we do that, we're then locked out for 10 days making any other changes, which is a little bit strange. It means we can't try something to improve the customer service, because if it fails, we're stuffed for 10 days, which is a bit of a shame. TalkTalk, on the other hand, well, they don't have any DLM, which is we find useful, although they are planning to offer that soon, I believe. Or possibly, you can, I was hearing yesterday that apparently we're a little odd that we don't have DLM, other people have it, so I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But we do have direct control over their profiles. So we can change the line profile, and within seconds it's resynced on a new profile. And we expose this to our customers, which is great. So we have very technical customers who can adjust their line profile themselves, and we have perhaps less technical customers who have IT support people or dealers that do it for them. So it actually pushes all that support work away from us and away from TalkTalk, which is great. They both have options like Annex M, that you can control the ADSL. And BT Wholesale, of course, have FTTC. And this is obviously becoming more and more popular. It's a very important move with what's happening with broadband connections. TalkTalk aren't providing a wholesale FTTC broadband type product equivalent to BT to us yet, but apparently they will soon. They do, however, have a rather interesting Ethernet over FTTC service. So it's still FTTC, but it's done as an Ethernet backhaul, so we actually get raw Ethernet frames. BT Wholesale do the same thing. It's not really the same as the typical broadband products, but the TalkTalk package is much simpler. It's a simple fixed price, unlimited usage, very straightforward. So that's quite interesting, and it's commercially a lot better than BT's equivalent. Another thing TalkTalk lacks is a 3dB profile. 3dB is a very low margin on DSL, so you have to have quite a good quality line to do it. But where you've got a good line, it can give you more speed. And it is available on BT, so where the DLM thinks it's appropriate, you get it. The problem is we can't just move lines between BT and TalkTalk, because if they have got a 3dB profile on BT, they'll get a slower speed on TalkTalk and people will complain to us. So we're hoping we'll get that at some point. I understand TalkTalk are working on it, but it's not as simple as it sounds, apparently, which surprised us. Billing. Don't we all love billing? Well, I've said BT bills are a challenge. I've said TalkTalk bills are a challenge. The problem is the huge amount of data. You get line items for everything on every line. You have thousands of line items, and you need to check them, so you need automation to check that. It's quite a bit of work. BT billing, we have to download the raw data from the e-billing website. They aren't requiring direct debit. I don't know if that's normal, but it would have been a challenge if they did, because, well, basically, I don't think we've ever had a correct BT bill where there isn't something wrong or something to dispute. So direct debit wouldn't really work well with that. TalkTalk bills, we get the raw data by FTP, which is a little bit easier to get. It is just as much fun trying to check the bills. We generally see fewer genuine mistakes, but on both BT and TalkTalk, there's the whole issue of SFI visits. So again, a bit of a challenge. They were direct debit only, but unfortunately, they can't follow the direct debit rules. And after we'd clawed back very large payments to TalkTalk because they didn't quite follow the notice or the amounts or something about half a dozen times, they eventually caved in and let us pay by backs, which makes life easier. So with both suppliers, we have now had to develop quite a comprehensive dispute management process. And it feeds back into our internal sort of systems where we have fault desk people dealing with SFI engineers. We need to have all of the notes very clearly so that the people we have to do the disputes can find out whether we should be disputing a charge or not and why. So it's quite a complicated process. It has even got as far as solicitors in some cases in order to get the rebates, get the SFI charges cancelled. We were thinking we ought to sell this to people, so perhaps we should develop it as a product. I can see it might be quite profitable. So moving on to operational, I've broken that down into 3 areas: orders, diagnostics and faults. Orders are fairly straightforward. Both of them have an automated way to talk. Now, TalkTalk is a very simple web-based XML, and someone here was talking about XML earlier. It really is very noddy. It's very straightforward. We post a bit of XML to them, and they post us some back through a secure socket. It's very simple. BT's XML is a bit of a nightmare if you're writing it yourself. I think it's designed for large businesses who might buy in some XML solution from an XML company, and that probably works. But if you're coding it yourself, it's a nightmare. It's signed SOAP messages with namespace all over the place. If you know anything about XML, it's horrid. But both work. They do, however, have a web-based system for both wholesale providers. So if you're a fairly small company, you might use that in order to place orders instead. And obviously, they can just do new installs and migrate things quite easily. I assume everyone here has heard about the new migration process that's happening that Ofcom are starting in June, I believe, where we don't have migration codes anymore. BT have been a lot more proactive about that. They've been in touch with us a lot, had conference calls, sent us lots of emails to try and make sure we're up to speed with how that's managed. TalkTalk have been a little dragging their heels. We've been chasing them, saying, how will this change in June? What are you doing differently? But between both of them, they're coping with the change in process. Although they were both surprised to hear that any end users with more than 10 staff are outside the scope of the new migration process. And if you didn't know that, you might want to find out more about it. So that might be a surprise to a few people. Diagnostics. Well, there's lots of tests. BT have quite a few tests. The copper line test is perhaps one of the more useful ones. That will actually check that the line is working properly. It's not got a connection to earth or battery or dodgy resistance or capacitance and so on. And it's testing the line quite comprehensively from the exchange. But BT do have one of their main diagnostics tests called KBD, knowledge-based diagnostics, and it's meant to be a sort of single diagnostic process that solves everything. Unfortunately, it will decide you've got a fault going down a particular route, and that'll be it. All of the diagnostics, all the people you end up speaking to fix the fault will decide that KBD has determined you have a performance problem, and therefore they must have you do speed tests and things like this, when actually you've got very clear diagnostics that say exactly what the problem is, and KBD's got the wrong end of the stick, unfortunately. It will also decide that there's no fault and tell you so. There is a test that BT have in the exchange, in a lot of exchanges, that will log in from a modem in the exchange. Now, this can be incredibly useful to differentiate between a customer being an idiot and BT having a problem. Because if you can log in from the exchange, that's everything from the exchange back to us is okay. And if the customer's in sync, but can't log in, then that's everything from the exchange to the customer okay. So you kind of manage to prove it's the customer being stupid or it's BT very quickly. Unfortunately, KBD has no way to force it to run one of these tests. You just have to be lucky and hope KBD makes the right guess about the problem and goes down that route and gives you the answer. Now, TalkTalk have a number of tests, some quite nice loss and margin graphs and so on, and they can do similar tests to test the line as BT. So with these tests, we can find out a lot. In our case, we have our constant monitoring on all the lines that gives us a huge amount of information without having to run these tests, but we do these as well. So finally, the last bit I'm going to try and cover here is faults. So it's worth remembering what we buy. We're buying an end-to-end service from the host link to the master socket. Unfortunately, BT Wholesale have a slightly odd approach to this. Now, until recently, they were a bit different to TalkTalk. Until recently, special faults investigation engineers, SFI, SFI2, I'm not sure whether it's the faults that are special or the engineers that are special, but as the customer that's special, thank you. Until recently, they had a system where basically they didn't want to send engineers on a wild goose chase, so if they showed that the problem was the end user equipment, then they would charge us for the engineer visit, and if they didn't, they wouldn't. And in principle, we're fairly happy with that. You know, we do all the checks to make sure we've eliminated the end user equipment. And if we have sent an engineer on a wild goose chase, paying for that engineer wasting his time is sensible. The principle wasn't ideal in that it was implemented as if you don't find a fault in BT, it must have been the customer equipment, which is obviously slightly flawed logic. I mean, we could say exactly the same. We could say we've changed all the customer equipment, so it must be in BT's network. And that was a bone of contention and caused disputes. But they never charged for work like uplift the network for broadband or rejumping in the exchange, which was good. Unfortunately, we're now told there's a new rule. And the new rule is that SFI2 is an optional BT PLC trading as Openreach service, which BT PLC trading as BT Wholesale offer us. And an SFI only tests the line to SIN 349, which is the metallic path spec. Now, he might go on and do some other work, but if it meets the metallic path, and that's all he's actually got to do, is test that and make sure it meets it, then we're charged for the engineer visit. And there's this process problem in BT that when we report a fault, they'll test the line and say, yep, the line's fine. It meets SIN 349 from our point of view in the exchange. It looks good. And then offer us this SFI engineer. And we're thinking that, if the line's fine, the last thing we need is an engineer to go out and test the line's fine. We know it's fine. Now solve the broadband problem. We're buying broadband, not a metallic path. So why would we be interested in an engineer that tests a metallic path? It's like sending an engineer out with Cat5 certification kit to test the patch lead. Why would we buy that? So we've run into a bit of a deadlock with BT because we've asked what happens next. What if we agree the line meets SIN 349? Now fix the broadband problem. And basically, BT seem to have no way to actually get a broadband fault fixed because the SFI2 engineer is just an Openreach service they offer us, which is clearly inappropriate if the line does meet SIN 349. So we're not quite sure where that's going to go. It's a serious issue, and we'd love to be able to get broadband faults fixed because that's what we're sold. So we're not quite sure on that. Now, TalkTalk had a slightly different approach from the start. TalkTalk's view was they would charge us for anything that BT PLC trading as Openreach would charge them. Now, this is a little bit batshit insane as well because they would charge for work in the exchange. So if TalkTalk have a faulty port on a DSLAM and need to re-jumper it to another port, they'd get BT to go out and do that, and then they charge us for that work. Well, clearly, that's their side of the demarcation point, the back of the master socket. Clearly, we shouldn't pay for that. So we don't, and we dispute that, and that's a challenge. Strangely enough, they do understand the concept that if they had to, I don't know if it's Cisco, but if they had a faulty BRAS and they had to get a Cisco engineer out to change the card, they seem to understand that they don't charge us for that. But when it's a faulty bit of copper they bought from BT, and that needs some work done on it to provide a service, they somehow think they can charge us for that. And we had a very long conversation with them where I had to ask about 6 times, what's the demarcation point on the service we buy from you? And eventually they conceded, yes, it is the NTE, the backplate of the NTE, the master socket. I said, good, so now we know everything, your side of that's your responsibility, you pay for fixing, and everything our side we pay for. And don't get me wrong, if we send an engineer on a wild goose chase, that's a different matter. That's something we shouldn't do. We should do the checks first. But if there's work to be done in the network, of course we shouldn't pay for it. We've already bought a broadband service. Why would we want to buy an SFI service from either BT Wholesale or TalkTalk Wholesale? So again, we've still got the same problem with them, and it's still an ongoing problem. And it's got to be resolved eventually. All we ask is both providers take responsibility for what they sell us, which is a broadband service, not a copper pair. So, with my little rant at the end about faults, which I do hope one day will be resolved, we'd love to work with BT to find a way of actually buying a working service and getting it fixed when it breaks. But to give you a summary, Wholesale from BT and from TalkTalk, very similar pricing. 20 CN's a bit higher, but that's a much smaller footprint now. It's going away. It's worth pointing out, TalkTalk have a lot of exchanges where BT only have 20 CN. So if you've got both carriers, you can provide a much better service to quite a lot of people in small exchanges. They're very similar technically. They're getting closer. TalkTalk doing 3DB will be nice, and FTTC and DLM for those that want it. BT giving us more control over profiles one day will be nice, and we'll have more equivalent services technically. They're equally similar over the stupidity of trying to charge us for SFI engineers. Hopefully they'll both get a solution to that. But it's really handy having 2 almost equivalent carriers, because we can sell a service where the terms to our customers are the same. The service is the same. With very slight differences, the customers can not care what carrier we use. So we have services where we sell a line by TalkTalk, a line by BT, bonded together with fallback. And that gives us extra redundancy. A big error in BT or in TalkTalk doesn't take our customer offline. So it's well worth having both. There is one more slide before questions, which we thought we'd mention. Wholesale Broadband Buyers Forum. Now, we're not trying to compete with UKNOF here. It's currently a closed web-based forum, and you're welcome to join. The website's at the bottom there. It's really just to try and get people who are buying from wholesale carriers, BT, TalkTalk, Vodafone, whoever, to be able to discuss with each other in a fairly safe forum the issues of dealing with these providers and the solutions that we come up with. And we've created that, and it's got, was it 60 odd sign-ups, I think? Something like that. We've got quite a few people in this room already signed up to it. It's very low traffic at the moment. We hope to do more with it. We might even arrange something where people meet up and have drinks at some point. But it's just about finding better ways of dealing with these carriers. So, questions?
on your previous slide, Adrian.
Yeah.
Sorry, is TalkTalk or BT Wholesale signed up for that?
Well, no, it's the forum is for people who buy from TalkTalk and BT Wholesale to be able to discuss dealing with them. So I
found them being part of the discussion.
No, well, not in the forum at the moment. Obviously, if we get this off the ground, the plan would be to engage with BT and TalkTalk on the issues we found.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Well, yeah, it does. I mean, I wasn't sure, and no one in Wholesale had mentioned it to me, but it could be useful to have them there so they can hear what the issues are.
Well, I think the idea of the forum is really that we can talk amongst ourselves and then come to BT and TalkTalk and try and work with you as a group, because at the end of the day, it shouldn't be a battle. We shouldn't be fighting each other. We should be working together, and if we can find ways of working together, that's great. But it's sort of deliberately aimed at the people buying the broadband.
But pardon me, but you got a whole bunch of guys in a secret club talking about what we should be doing, and then you kind of turn up with a big long list. Maybe engaging them to understand so for example, you talked about the DLM. Just use that as an example. Could be that's, oh yeah, we could do that, take a year, or you could have this other thing in a week. It's that prioritisation that's probably we'll have to try and work out the best way of doing it. It is new. Maybe it's useful to get the carriers engaged sooner rather than later. So yeah, useful feedback. We'll think about it. Anyone else? Really? Okay.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.